Hello, folks. This session of the Red Nation podcast is going to be hosted by myself, Jorden Revels, who is a member of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, as well as a member of the East Coast Freedom Council for the Red Nation. I'm also a Udall scholar in tribal public policy and a community organizer based in Southeastern North Carolina. I'm calling in from Lumbee territory down in Pembroke, North Carolina. And with me today is Dr. Malinda Maynor Lowery, who is a professor of history at UNC Chapel Hill and a director of the Center for the Study of the American South. She is a member of the Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina, and Dr. Lowery is an award-winning author and film director. One of her books, The Lumbee Indians: An American Struggle, will be referenced here today. And the book itself is a survey of Lumbee history from the 18th century to the present. Dr. Lowery is a powerhouse of talent and knowledge for our peoples. Dr. Lowery, much appreciated with you being on today. Is there anything else you'd like in terms of providing your introduction?
Just thanks, Jorden. It's just great to be able to say that, or it's a great day to say that I'm on the lands of the Occaneechi-Saponi in North Carolina, kind of about 2 hours, 100 miles or so from where you are, and I'm in the city of Durham, settler-occupied territory of Durham. And hoping to be into homeland maybe tomorrow or Sunday.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Coming home for the weekend.
Yeah, well,
Love
you
it.
know, it's that time of year.
Yeah, holiday season.
We're trying
a
to
must.
limit our travels. I don't know about you, but it's like we're not eating with anybody. This has been a really weird year,
Yeah.
not to get together with our dozens of family members.
Awesome. So, got to start this off the proper Lumbee way and asking the question, who's your people?
Who's your people? Jorden, my people are Cummingses from the St. Anna community. My mother's family, my grandparents are Foy and Bloss Cummings, and sometimes when they say, "Who's that?" Okay, so down the line a little bit, sometimes people know who Preacher Mike is, or Preacher Mike Cummings. He is my uncle, my mother's brother, and so folks sometimes know who I am because they know my Uncle Mike. And then on my dad's side of the family, they're from the Red Banks community, which, anyway, kind of near the Lumber River. There's a cemetery called the Sandcut Cemetery that we think of as our home cemetery, and they're Maynors. So my grandparents were Wayne and Lucy Maynor. And yeah, just been connected to like Brooks's, some Lowerys. I married a Lowery, so I wasn't born a Lowery. But got some Lowerys back there in the family tree, then, or the family bush, maybe. And yeah, so who's your people? And where did they stay at?
Right. So my people hail from the Carters and Revels. On my mother's side, her father's name is Lex Carter, her mother's name is Terry Carter, and these are the Carters from around Maynor Center, also related to the Locklears. And on my father's side, his mother's name is Brenda Jones, who's through relation to Sampson, as well as Robert Glenn Revels. So these being the Sampsons around the Deep Branch area and also going into Saddle Tree and a greater community outside of Pembroke.
The Maynor Center Maynors. So that was one thing we always used to say when growing up is, there's so many Lumbee families that you might have actually the same last name but not really be related, right? So you said you were related to some Locklears, so it's like, which Locklears? Like, we really have to dig in deep, because it might be Fairmont Locklears, not like Prospect Locklears. Or like in the case of the Maynors, you've got our Red Banks bunch, and then you've got this Maynor Center bunch, which the Maynor Center Maynors, I'm also related to them, but like a different way. But the Maynor Center Maynors, I'm not related to really on my dad's side, like the Maynor, the Wayne and Lucy Maynor side. So anyway, I know right where you're at. I know where your family is.
That is such an important point, because it's such a process. And just for folks, for clarification, as soon as Dr. Lowery and I got on the line with this, we spent about 15 minutes doing a deep dive genealogy into both sides of our families to try and find that connection of place and kinship. And that is something that is very integral to Lumbee culture and basic introductions.
It's huge. Like, if we went back far enough, we could find Henry Berry Lowry. Like,
Right. Absolutely.
probably where we are both kin to some of his people. So we only went back like 3
Right.
generations. You know, we could keep going.
Yeah, it's funny you mention that because it reminds me of some experiences I've had, and also the shared experiences that colleagues have mentioned to me, like situations where they're in an airport and there's just some sensation they get about a person, and they
Right.
go up to them and ask them, "Are you Lumbee?"
Right. Are you Lumbee?
And of course, it happens that they are Lumbee, and they get into the basic "Who's your people?" And now you're getting into this lengthy discussion, finding out how you're connected to this person who could be thousands of miles away from North Carolina. You just happen to find each other,
Right.
and
And
it's
not,
always
like,
so interesting.
not even grown up there, or
Hmm.
it's baby, who's your people? It's just amazing. My parents, like, and you get that feeling at the back of your neck, right? That's like
Hmm.
prickling. Uh, my parents, I'll never forget this. We were at Disney World, okay, and I was like 13. It was, we went to Disney World, and we're walking across a bridge, and we heard some voices. And my parents, I swear to God, they turned, right? They stopped, and they both looked, and they said, "They're from home." And I was
Mm.
like, "What?" Like, I'm in Disney World. Um, and they said, "They're from home." So they trotted right up to these people, and just like you said, you know, "Are you Lumbee?" And they could hear it in the folks' voice, right? Like,
Mm.
probably our listeners can't really detect maybe so much that you and I have like a really distinct accent or whatever, but if
Right.
we're at home, we're talking much more like our folks from home do. But also, like, our folks have a really distinctive sound to their voice,
Right.
super distinctive. So if folks are just talking, you can definitely pick up that they're from Lumbee land. And it's, again, Florida. They're there having a good time on their vacation. We're on vacation, and just a few words out of these folks' mouth, and my parents are like, "Are you Lumbee?" So, yeah.
Right, and it can lead you to all types of places. I know that a lot of times I find myself in conversations with elders and folks who, after exchanging information, they're able to tell me more about my own family lines and genealogy than I can. And they're listing off this long list of interactions and connection points with their own families or extended relatives that have interactions with my family members, like maybe so and so talked at some point, or they were married and then
Right,
divorced.
divorced.
They have all these histories that I didn't even know about myself, and it's like I find out more about my own family from people who aren't my family through these interactions, and it's the most amazing and wild thing to me.
It is, and the older I get, the more I expect that shared knowledge is going to kind of diminish.
Mm,
Like, I think maybe just, I mean, I was born in 1972, right? So
mhm,
my parents were born in the 30s and 40s. Many people's grandparents, of course, were born in the 30s and 40s now, great grandparents even. But being able to, I just thought it was kind of like a grandparent generation thing, you know,
right.
where, well, my grandparents were born in, the teens. 19 teens, or 1907 was my
Mhm,
grandfather was born. And so, or even earlier. Anyway, being able to say, like, that this is sort of an early 20th century kind of knowledge base, I just thought
right.
that that's what it was. But it just turns out that, like, I don't think it matters how old you are. My daughter's 13, and people are telling her, "Oh, your cousin your cousin's is so and so's baby daddy about, and they dated, and and so it's like, okay, no, that really is the way that we know each other. And we know each other going back like generations because of that stuff.
Right.
And then we know everything about like where our people live, where they're buried. If
Mhm.
you just have like, I'm glad we had this sort of luxury time, right? Like, you
Yeah.
can sit here and talk. Jordan and I can talk forever, pretty much,
Yeah.
about these subjects.
Mhm.
And it's not just a thing about being born in the early part of the 20th century. You know, it's just carried on and on.
Right. Absolutely. There's always a saying that Lumbees can talk.
Yes. Lord,
Older
yes.
Lumbee relatives, elders, hours and hours and hours. And it's the most amazing thing because it's like this embedded level of oral traditions that is still kind of found its way over generations and is still maintained to this day. And even though sometimes it can be a bit bothersome when the auntie or uncle is going on and on, but it's something that's unique and also a unique aspect of our culture and a way our people find kinship and communicate.
Right. And have this shared identity. Again, we're
Right.
so different. Like, we're as different as as any other group of people, but we're constantly finding ways to share something, and that kinship piece is like the first. And of course, I knew you, Jordan, before you knew me. Like, I knew you because you were working with Eco Robinson,
Mhm.
right? And Donna and
Yeah.
them. And so, being able to say, like, here's somebody who is taking all that knowledge and bringing it into the world of, activating your community, your like generation of people, your peers,
Mhm.
for the health of our species and the planet, is kind of what makes, I think, you known. And it's what makes our folks, some of our folks, known now when they do things in the community but also in the world,
Right.
outside the community.
Mhm.
um, that kind of gives us another kind of thing to talk about, right? Because we can talk about kinship and our shared history, and then we can also talk about the things that are going to inform our future.
Absolutely. And I think it's something that's really important to note because that concept itself is the cultural values of kinship, that connection to place and relation. And all of these things are heavily mentioned within your book. And it is that value that is so enduring and long lasting within our community at large. And this brings me one of the many quotes from your book that really intrigued me in relation to the timelessness of that question of who's your people. There's a long lasting presence of Indians, both pre contact and post contact, that exists within the area of Robeson County. And there's one section in your book that highlights this well, and it's in reference to the supposed riots that were forming after the events of the Boston Tea Party in 1773. And to quote, another statement contained in the riot document provides a clue about the American Revolution in this place and time. The rioters were, quote, living upon the king's land, end quote, and not paying the quit rent. Indians would not have agreed with this description. They were not rogues or squatters, but an established community whose kinship ties stretched back generations. Some had probably been living on that land since before the king knew about it. So, could you detail for some of our listeners about the coalescence of Indians up to the establishment of the later to be known location called the settlement?
Yeah. Um, so this is a question that is kind of as broad as it is deep, right?
Hmm.
You and I know where our ancestors are buried, going back to before that document that you read was written. That was written about 1773, I think.
Hmm.
So we know where the ancestors who were living at that time, we know where they're buried. We
Hmm.
also then, I think, have to assume that their parents, their grandparents, people born in the 1730s and earlier, are also buried roughly where our folks now are buried in what became Robeson County, and the settlement. The folks before that, right? Indigenous people living in the 1600s and the 1500s and the 1400s and early. These European conceptions of time, those European conceptions of time really only start mattering, I think, in the time frame in which you and I remember. So when I think of that as back to the 17 teens, probably, that's the time period in which you and I kind of have access to.
Right.
So if that's the present time, the time since, say, 1700 to the present, the time before the present time, our ancestors were probably members of dozens and dozens of tribal communities that lived between, like, the James River in Virginia. Again, sorry to be using the English names, but that's where we are. The James River in Virginia and the Great Peedee River in South Carolina. And this is a really large, tens of thousands of square miles of territory. We know that our ancestors come from that territory because the genealogical clues we have, the surnames, but also all kinds of other clues and records that point people to being in a place at a certain time. All that adds up to patterns of migration that start in the territory between, like, the coast looking east to west, the outer banks of what is now North Carolina, over to, the foothills or so of the Appalachian Mountains. So you've got this north, south, east, west territory that our folks come from that's, really large. I'm sure I'm underestimating when I say dozens and dozens. It's probably hundreds of tribal communities that occupied that territory, lived in it, stewarded it, developed different cultures, spoke different languages, well before Europeans obviously arrived. And their communities were as different from each other as, the nations of Eastern Europe are from each other, or as any other kind of intensely diverse cultural borderland, I think, in the world. I think that's the world that our ancestors lived in. And so, what anthropologists tell us is that these folks were speaking one or more of three different language families. So they might have been Iroquoian speakers or Algonquian speakers or Siouan speakers. These languages are mutually unintelligible, they're very different. People, of course, had to be multilingual because nations were living in such close proximity to one another and trading and marrying and, engaging in relations with each other, diplomatic relations, for centuries, thousands of years. And so that, kind of organic diplomacy and cultural evolution meant that, by the time before the present time, meaning those centuries in between, say, European arrival and 1700, that Native people were used to adapting, right, culturally, because they'd had to do it always. Then when Europeans came in the mix, of course, there was, like, some adapting that took place, but there was also a lot of destruction. And in the middle of this cultural diversity and linguistic diversity, when you had, I think, widespread death because of disease or because of enslavement, also because of warfare and the particular strategies of warfare that Europeans used, people began to, their cultural shifts became much more rapid, probably. And so what we think what I think happened, what we think happened, we meaning other people, archaeologists, anthropologists, and folks that have studied this, are thinking about, is that these multilingual communities began to coalesce and speak the language that they had in common, which increasingly became English, because English was relatively quickly the most predominantly spoken language on this landscape. Changed pretty quickly, and so the depopulation that occurred to our ancestors meant that their cultures shifted pretty dramatically. And one of the big shifts, I think, was language, right? It was being able to say, for survival purposes, we are going to move in with people who are culturally more familiar to us or who have worldviews that are more familiar to us. And because of the loss of knowledge, we are all now generally speaking the language that these newcomers speak. And so that particular change, I think, is a fact of this coalescence that has generated who we are in the present time. And along with that kind of language change, you have a lot of movement, right? You've always had movement because Native people, like everybody, they just move. They move around. And so they have where their ancestors are buried, but they're moving around. They always know where their home is, and they also are good at creating new homes. So amid this devastation, our ancestors did what they had always done, and they began to move, to find a safe space, to find a place where they could be left alone, to find a place where they could live with other people who shared their worldviews and their understandings, especially of these European invaders. And we know from archaeology that there were indigenous people living in what is now Robeson County since probably 13,000 years ago. And the folks who joined those people were coming from this wide territory that I mentioned before, from what is now Virginia to what is now South Carolina, east to the Outer Banks and west to the foothills of the Appalachians. So all of that, change meant that people were on the road. They were moving down to what became Robeson County. And as you and I know, like it's still swamps today.
Yeah.
There's like a lot of fields there now, but especially in 1550 or 1600. I mean, you were
prior
not.
to the levees.
Yeah. There was no drainage systems. I mean, this was remote territory. It didn't appear on any European maps, until the mid 19th century. So Europeans didn't know about it much, and the little bit that they did know, like that document indicated that you read, I mean, they were afraid of it. They were afraid of us as people. They didn't understand this territory, but we knew that it was a safe place. We meaning in the present time and in the time before the present time. Our ancestors knew that it was a safe place, and so that's where we went. And the idea that we're speaking English here, we're also practicing Christianity, because belief systems are going to continue even as the forms of the belief systems change.
Right.
And so we're beginning to practice Christianity, I think, at the same time as other Europeans are doing, or other African descended peoples here are doing. And so we're bringing that forward as well. So speaking English, practicing Christianity, that means those two things alone are going to change so much of what people recognize as quote unquote indigenous culture, but we have, I think, or our ancestors along with us, we're always indigenizing those things. Like we talked about, like with the language, we speak English, but we have this dialect of it. We have these vocabulary words, and we're indigenizing the heck out of that language. We're also doing the same with Christianity, and that's a much more complicated story. But it's like, we're taking this stuff that we haven't had a choice, but it's been foisted upon us. We haven't had a choice.
Right.
We've accepted some parts of it. We've indigenized other parts of it. We've rejected parts of it. And to me, that's all wrapped up in this diversity of ancestors that we possessed, right? all these incredible, this cultural um, gumbo, for a good metaphor, that
Yeah.
what was here, it still is here. It's just it just feels different. I wonder sometimes if our time before the present time ancestors, if they would recognize. I think they would. I think they'd recognize us.
I think it would too.
I hope so.
I think maybe the dialect has gotten heavier
Yeah. Uh-huh.
over time, but I think it would still stand with the original meanings.
Right. Right.
That little twang is definitely still consistent.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely.
And it's funny that you mentioned that cultural gumbo aspect, because with that is what was referred to as a mixed crew, MIXT,
Mhm.
and that noting the increased racialization and diversification, unification of the Lumbee community, because it was not predominantly based on any blood quantums, but rather is, uh, in my interpretation, is folks who sought refuge within the community were accepted as long as they weren't going to be too much of a threat, as long as they accepted the community and most importantly, the community accepted them,
Right. Their
then
values.
they were
Mhm.
exactly. So with that increased or the development of this cultural gumbo, um, there's the other side of that, which is the racialization of policies and discriminatory legislation that is eventually introduced to break up that unification, uh, which started before the 1800s but ramped up increasingly so in severity at the start of the century. Could you touch on that a little bit?
Are you thinking about like the Civil War or before that or
I would say, yeah, we can start with Civil War.
okay. Um yeah, so, this idea that Lumbees are a mixed crew, that comes from those settler governments trying to understand who we are, right?
Mm,
And as in other kinds of communities throughout what became the United States, whenever European, Native, and African peoples are getting together and doing stuff, that's considered to be a threat to the planter class, to the elites who wish
mm,
to maintain control. And that threat, has to be neutralized, basically. And so, like you said, like that's kind of the process of racialization everywhere in North America. I just think that you see it really clearly in the Lumbee community when we have this sort of um, culturally rich place that by the early 19th century in the Civil War gets relabeled as mulatto.
right.
so, so mulatto is a word. A lot of folks don't use that word much now, but it's really common in the historical documents. It refer in the 19th century before the Civil War. It referred to a skin tone for the most part. So when a census taker wrote mulatto on a census record, what they meant to say was, this is a person who looks in my mind like a racial mixture.
Right.
Someone who had white ancestry and African ancestry, European ancestry and African ancestry. The racial composition of that person was not, the actual heritage or ancestry of that person was not relevant to the census taker. They were looking at the person's skin color. So, but of course, everything gets reduced and essentialized in Western European frameworks. So the poor census
right.
taker, regardless of the kind of actual skin shade of most of a household, they would just write mulatto for everybody.
Mhm.
And you do sometimes have funny situations in the census records where certain household members are labeled mulatto and others are labeled white. All these people, or black. Like there's no evidence that these folks are members of any other family other than the one that they're living with. You can go back in time to other census records and confirm that these are blood relatives, right? But
Yeah.
the census takers like almost can't help it, like there's this spasm of of like busting out of the categories, and they're like, I don't know what to do. This person doesn't look
Right.
mulatto. I can't label them that way. So anyway, so occasionally you see Lumbees getting labeled something else, but for the most part, all of this like cultural diversity coming from all over the world gets reduced into this one category. And so in that one category, out of that springs a new kind of division and a new kind of unity, I
Mhm.
think, at the same time, and it's complicated. Um, but the mulatto so-called racial category that was applied to us was something that we continued to resist because we would continue to have the Hoosier people conversation. You know,
Right.
Lumbee people would continue to say, I am going to place you according to who your family is and where y'all are from, like where your ancestors were buried. I'm not going to keep applying this outsider's racial label onto you. So I just can't imagine a world in 1860 or 1880 when one Lumbee person said to another, like, you're a mulatto like me. You know, I
Right.
just can't imagine that being the case. I think they would have said, you're a Revels and a Jones. I'm a Cummings and a Maynor. Like, who's your people? Like, where are our ancestors connected? And that's a completely
Yeah.
different conversation that just doesn't fit in like the Western European mindset. So the Civil War piece of it is just, it has to do with the Confederacy, building its identity, its national identity around the enslavement of people of African descent, um, and trying to make that enslavement perpetual. And the Lumbees in that, context are doing some of the same things that like our family does now. I mean, some of them will vote with their non-native neighbors. Some of them will vote with their native family members. Sometimes there's different. Sometimes there's different just strategies, within a family to deal with a government whose policies you find abhorrent.
Right.
And in the Civil War, you had a similar kind of, I think, division emerge within the Lumbee community. You had some to say, yep, we are going to ally our interests with this white supremacist government that's going to war against another government, another white supremacist government. Um, or we're going to again take this as an opportunity to like stake our claim as an autonomous nation against those racial categories. So, Lumbee people that wanted to establish themselves securely within a white supremacist government, be it South or North, began to adopt a sense of themselves as Native people that also meant that they were not Black people.
Mm.
That they begin, I think, a process to not necessarily reject their African ancestors, but definitely not talk about them,
Mm.
not celebrate them, not embrace them, not think about their identities as connected to other people who identified as Black. You
Right.
had other Lumbees, like our famous ancestor Henry Berry Lowery and some of his family, that they didn't just reject, the Confederacy, they also rejected the government of the North, the so-called Union. They also rejected these ideas of racial hierarchy that removed us from our kinship connections. And that the process of rejecting the racial hierarchy is like, it's not pretty. you
Yeah.
know it's just it's a violent history. It's very sad. And while we look at that time now and sometimes say, oh, he was such a hero, or oh, I mean, he and his family members, his wife, his mother,
Mm.
um his brothers' wives, his cousins' wives, all their children. I mean, all these people were demonized, and not only were demonized, but lost their lives um, in terrible, terrifying ways in some cases, because they refused to go along with this eternal enslavement that the Confederacy, really wanted during the Civil War. And I'm also, Jorden, I'm going on like really long, so feel free to just like
No,
interrupt
you're
me,
perfectly fine.
because all my thoughts are just spinning out today. So, no, feel free to, if I'm like not going down on the right path, interrupt
Oh
me.
no, I think you're going down a right path that is including all the tidbits of complexity that is necessary for
Mm-hmm.
folks to fully grasp the dynamics at play here, because it's not something that's easy to generalize. There are a lot of nuances, and even to this day, with what you said about Lumbee folks aligning themselves with either staying with this system or riding against the grain, is prevalent even into this day, right? And it's important to understand the different dynamics at play, like with Trump and his influence on the Lumbee vote population from 2016 to 2020. That is one thing that was baffling to me, is that regardless of how much of a fuck up his presidency has been, objectively speaking, subjectivity included, this has been a train wreck, a never ending flaming train wreck.
Mm-hmm.
But even despite that, folks still grasping on to what's going to be beneficial, not only for themselves, but other folks in the community. In this case, being him being the first president to ever uh, actually talk about offering a pathway to federal recognition. So I think all this stuff is very necessary in understanding those dynamics, but also getting to the further root of some other issues, such as the entrenched anti-blackness, anti-black sentiments that exist within the community, and that further racialization slash assimilation into the greater settler society.
Right.
And so, with that, there are multiple instances that are referenced within your book, and talking about situations where voting rights were amended for natives in North Carolina, folks who were by the legal system referred to as persons of color, and including those within the mixed crew of the Lumbee, starting with things like the outlawing of non-white folks to own alcoholic establishments, right? So basically preventing any non-white folks from selling alcohol, right? Which back then was a lucrative business and provided a means of income to an impoverished community. So with that, there's this level of ramping up of severity of this legislation that you talk about in your book from the beginning of the 1800s, and it really just kind of like comes to a peak with land relations in 1850s and the resulting emergence of resistance that comes against that, because there's always been this history of pushing back, whether it is the Drowning Creek Indian crew that fought back against the North and the South at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
or with the Lowry gang. It's because of this increased tension that folks have to rise up and they have to resist this force that is coming down and harming their community and dividing it.
Right.
And so, with that, we you mentioned things like was this the mule? I think it was mule theft.
The tide mule sort of incidents, the ways
Right.
that land would
Yes.
get stolen. Yeah, white landowners would take their mule onto an Indian's land, um, and tie it there, and then call the sheriff and say that Indian's got my mule tied up on his land. And so, the sheriff would then basically initiate a court action that would
Mm.
take that Indian landholder to court. And if, the person couldn't pay fines or court fees, of course, at this time that we're talking about kind of pre-Civil War um, time period too. At this time, Indians were not allowed to testify against whites in court.
Right.
So it was, the white landowners say so. And so
Mm,
naturally, the native person was found guilty, and if they couldn't pay the fine or couldn't pay whatever the cost was, then the land was given to his accuser.
mm,
And one of the things that's just really kind of important to understand, like why that's so harmful to us, is because the ancestors of that generation that was experiencing those tied mule incidents, their ancestors fought like, tooth and nail to get a hold of land that was going to be theirs and which no government, the state government nor the U.S. government, could take away. And of course, the story of much Native history throughout Turtle Island is this idea of governments negotiating land away from Native people, either transparently or often, of course, not transparently. Um, and doing that with tribal representatives who were not authorized to speak for tribal communities.
right.
The difference with the Lumbees is that when other tribal representatives were negotiating away land, our ancestors were figuring out how to keep a hold of land. And they were doing that in particular by getting the deeds to their property registered in the county court. And so when you're doing Lumbee history research, you got to go to these county level records, state level records, things like the census, which are really, actually detail a lot of information about our our folks, because it's not just kind of anonymous bureaucrats in the federal and state government keeping the records. It's people
Mm.
who really care about property, at the county register of deeds that are keeping records of our ancestors and their land. So, you know, that whole idea that a white person who just wanted to increase their wealth could do it by lying, um, telling a story against us, using a rigged system to their advantage. Um, one of the reasons that's so painful is because our ancestors took steps, concrete steps, to say, how are we going to maintain a hold of what we've got using these systems of law that Europeans brought here?
Mm.
And for those same Europeans to turn around and use their systems of law, to take what we have, is just, I mean, as you said, like, we'll rise up, like, it burns us up, you know, to see that again and again. But it was so common, especially during this period when Indians could not testify against whites in court, and when Indians did not have the right to vote. The state constitution had taken it away in the 1830s. And so when we're considered citizens for the purpose of paying taxes, right?
Mhm.
And but we're not allowed, obviously, to sit on juries. We're not allowed to vote. We're not allowed to testify against our accusers in court. We're not allowed to do what every other white person can do, which is trade liquor,
Mm.
in the 1830s, or really, any time up to much of the 20th century. Indians were penalized for making and selling alcohol when whites were not, and whites were certainly not penalized for buying it. But Indians were penalized for making it and selling it. And like you see with native indigenous economies under settler governments all over what is now the United States, we are just our economic activity is criminalized heavily. And so when our
Mm.
land ownership is criminalized heavily, we get really angry, you know. And it's,
Right.
you can hear it in my voice, probably, like, it's not like one family getting angry. It's like generations,
It just like
of
comes
anger.
up in an eruption.
Yeah. Yeah. And so Trump coming in, or anybody coming in saying, like, "Oh, we're going to do this for you." No, whatever, dude. Like, it's past time for y'all to be accountable to the theft, to using the law to which we've abided, for using that against us. Like, and I think people are kind of over it. And when you think about like what Lumbee voters are doing or not doing, it's like the lost colony. It's like this big mystery. Like, why do Lumbees vote for Trump?
Yeah.
It's like, well, that's actually not the important question, you know. It's like the important question is not what happened to the Europeans who got so-called lost on Roanoke Island.
Right.
I mean, the important question is like, what do people want now?
Mm.
And I think our voters, they want these systems of law that we've been forced to abide by and heavily punished and criminalized for not abiding by. We want those systems of law to work for us. And we're using every tool at our disposal to try to coerce, I think, elected officials into making sure those systems of law work for us.
Right, and that's like part of the interesting dynamic that we're faced with in Indian country is that we're in the situation where we need representation, but at the same time, folks who have been in already aren't really making any necessary changes, and so folks are wanting something new. They're looking for anything new that is going to be providing us with something that's going to be advantageous because folks need resources. You look around in this area, the biggest thing most folks will just cling to is economic development because it's so necessary in the community because we lack so much resources and have lacked them for generations. Even those who are blessed to be more well off um, are still not as well off as they could be had they uh, been born and raised somewhere else within the state.
Right. And
And
somebody
so,
else. Yeah.
right.
And and it's so ironic because we do own so much land. We have
Mm,
the most biodiverse landscape. I think, really in on the East Coast, I mean in terms of like native plant species and stuff like that, like
right. It's
it's
incredible.
incredible. It's phenomenal. So the wealth is there. It's been
Mm,
extracted, continually since those mixed crew labels that we were getting in the 1750s. I mean, starting before that, people were busy extracting lumber from our community. Those are native longleaf pine trees. I mean, they were
hmm
cutting those down and sending them overseas. Um, the extraction economy has been enormous, and so while there is this we should be able to turn the wealth that we have to our advantage. And I feel like that's part of what frustrates me is like having to run up against this need for economic development. It's like if you would just leave it to us,
mm.
to figure it out, like this would be the wealthiest place, certainly in North Carolina, if not elsewhere. So I mean, not overnight, but it's just, to me, like the ingredients are there. It's just that people can't get over themselves extracting what we have,
Mm.
taking it somewhere else.
Right, and it's like this increasingly problematic process of extraction, which is since the 1800s transcended beyond just racist white settlers who want land and the government, but also now corporate entities. And you look at other situations where folks are wanting to extract resources from the ground, whether it's frack gas, oils, or the transformation of what happened then to now is wood chip pellet production. You
Mm-hmm.
know, tearing up trees, turning them to wood pellets, and then shipping them off to France
Right.
as biofuel.
Right.
So it's this continued transformational process of how this extraction has come in our communities, and we're not really put at the forefront of these conversations, or even left in charge of any form of dictation or consultation on what that development looks like. And I think it's also that's a very reoccurring element with what led to the eventual resistance of a lot of these issues and this problematic legislation, which came in the force of entities like the Drowning Creek Indians, but also the establishment of the Lowry Gang. Could you touch on that and how basically that started and the direction it went into? with Henry Berry Lowery?
Yeah, so at the tail end of the Civil War, uh, the Lowery family, meaning Allen Lowery, his wife Mary, Allen's brothers and sisters, a whole just big extended family group there, were well known in the Robeson County area for their sympathies with the Union. Now, of course, that's what Confederates wrote down about Allen Lowery, was that he was a Union sympathizer. I think what was happening there was that Allen Lowery was not a sympathizer with any particular settler government. He did not like the Confederacy, and so was pretty hell bent on making sure that the Confederacy didn't get to succeed in his community. The other thing about Allen Lowery was that he was not the wealthiest person in Robeson County, but he was the wealthiest Native person in Robeson County. They were large landowners, the Lowerys. They had turpentine farms, for example. So thinking about extraction from trees, I mean, they were definitely participating in that. Like they were, leveraging their natural and intellectual resources to make sure that their property and their families were secure, right? So they really didn't like the way that the Confederacy was honing in on that, and the Confederacy was doing that in particular by stealing labor from young Indian men to send to Fort Fisher, this fort they were building in Wilmington, North Carolina, and building that fort and basically a cesspool of, typhus, malaria, dysentery. I mean, every kind of like infectious and epidemic disease you could have was present at Fort Fisher. So young Lumbee men were going there and dying, right? They're going there and getting sick and coming home and getting their relatives sick. Like they are suffering because of active things the Confederacy is doing. And so when Allen Lowery's like nephews start getting sent to, and sons start getting sent to Fort Fisher, I think he just becomes much more open about his resistance to Confederate control. And in that process, what was called the Home Guard, which was kind of a militia unit, basically, of the Confederacy, that not that different from Colonel John Chivington's unit in Colorado that killed Cheyenne and Arapaho people at the Sand Creek Massacre. The Robeson County Home Guard was kind of not as well organized as John Chivington's unit, but unfortunately, but I think really had to. They were charged with showing up or showing out for the Confederacy in terms of how many men they could capture and send to Fort Fisher. So when the Home Guard really kind of picked up on Allen Lowery's resistance to this, he was encouraging his sons and his nephews and all their relatives to hide out in the swamps rather than get captured. And so the Home Guard basically executed Allen and his oldest son, William, who had served at Fort Fisher, in 1865, the spring of 1865. So right at the tail end of the conflict now known as the Civil War. When this mob basically lynched Allen and William Lowery, Allen's other sons and nephews and some of his neighbors had been lying out in the swamps trying to escape, this kidnapping. They also began to emerge out in the open. And I don't know how well coordinated this rebellion was, and just in terms of like how much strategy there was. Sometimes people compare it to the Modoc War, for example, or even to Chief Joseph's conflict in some ways in Idaho. But, all these things are different. To me, it reminds me a little bit more of like Joaquin Murrieta's various rebellions, to where Allen's son, Henry Berry Lowery, who was his youngest son, basically wanted to redistribute wealth to really poor white, black, and Indian families that were all suffering because of the Confederacy and because of what the Home Guard was doing.
Mhm.
So he and his brothers, his cousins, his wife's in-laws, his wife's brothers rather, would get together and take from the smokehouses of plantation owners. They would take livestock, or they would take goods and property from their homes, um, and sell it, food from their fields. Sell it, redistribute it to other families who could not afford to eat. So,
Mhm.
this sort of raiding process, I think, was kind of what started the so-called war, this Lowery War, as we now call it. Um, but quickly it kind of escalated, because when Allen and William were lynched by the Confederacy, you know, Henry Berry and his brothers began to execute all the people that they could find that had been part of that lynch mob. And
Right.
so over the years, and they killed more people as well, but over the years, about 6, 7 years that this went on, they wound up killing almost 2 dozen white officials in the county of Robeson. Almost all of these people, with the exception of two, I think, all these people were members of the Conservative Democrat Party, which called itself the Party of White Supremacy, following the Civil War, because their real interest was, if they couldn't reestablish slavery, then they were going to reestablish slavery by any other means necessary. They
Mhm.
were going to institute these black codes. They were going to make sure that their formerly enslaved neighbors didn't have any kind of economic or political opportunity at all. And they ran on this platform. They were the party of white
Yeah.
supremacy. And all of the people except two that Henry Berry and his cousins and brothers killed were members of that political party. So historians like me, they look at these records and they say, well, was it just a vengeance campaign, or was he kind of playing at Robin Hood, or what was he doing? Did it have anything political about it? Well, I think, as we've seen with protests in 2020, and especially uh, the so-called looting, it's not my word, or not my favorite word, but that's the word that
Right.
comes to mind. So with the so-called looting that's taking place in urban areas in 2020, you know, that riot is political protest, right? It's a
Mm.
profound form of political protest to
Absolutely.
seize goods and redistribute them away from systems that don't value human life and that value property
Mm.
over human life. And that's the same kind of thing that I think Henry Berry and his so-called gang were doing. They were redistributing property away from systems that don't value human life towards actual people. And so, was that a political act? Of course it was. The fact that
Mm.
it also supported interests that were campaigning against conservative Democrats, in this case the Republican Party. That was sort of coincidental, in the way that Alan Lowry's disdain for the Confederacy didn't necessarily mean support for the Union. You know, I think Henry Berry Lowry's disdain for the conservative Democrats didn't necessarily mean support for the Republicans. But
Right.
in settler colonial party politics, you know,
Yeah, it's always a
it's
binary in
always
that
this
case.
binary. And that's what we're seeing now, with Trump and Biden and whatever. It's like,
Mm.
people think that a vote for one is a rejection of the other. It's like, yeah, no, we're, we're faced with constrained choices. And what we need to do is build a new system. And I think that's what Henry Berry he was playing his part in building a new system.
Absolutely. And it really get touches on the dialectical materialisms that were present and continue to be present even to this day, not just in Lumbee land and Indian country, but across this country and across the globe as well, is this necessity for redistributing just basic needs and resources to folks who need it, because these systems have shown time and time again, even in the worst case scenario. I can't believe I'm going through this level of a pandemic for almost a year now in this country, and the level of disdain for human life that I've experienced or have experienced in passing through the stories of others is horrendous.
Right.
And yet we have the audacity to call ourselves a first world country, a leading power, when our social support systems are so lackluster to the degree that folks like I just struggle with the concept of even imagining that before I had the blessing and privilege to get insurance through my job, that the thought of me needing to resort to a GoFundMe for something like health and covering health costs at a hospital if I got COVID,
Mm-hmm.
or if I couldn't afford my utilities, if my water and my power is going to be cut off. Like, that is such an absurd concept that is so American, uh, and is just so representative of this issue we're still facing to this day and have not quite gotten over. We've gotten a lot better off, but it's still a present and ongoing struggle for folks across the globe.
Yeah, it's incredible. And, thinking about our systems of mutual aid, I mean, that's the other thing
Mm.
that I think Henry Berry was really doing, is that he was, I read an amazing article. Well, I don't know if the article was amazing. The story was amazing. The folks seemed
Yeah,
amazing.
there's a
Yeah,
difference.
I don't know if the article was amazing, but the folks being profiled seemed amazing. Related,
Mm.
just Dene, Navajo mutual aid efforts, and just looking at that and being so proud of how um, indigenous knowledges are brought to bear on 2020 problems, where the success is so obvious. You know, um, what does it take for people to see our people as viable um, stewards, of not
Mm.
just land in some kind of romantic way or the water and the sky, but viable stewards of people, of human life, of society.
Mm.
And as stewards, we can also govern. Um, and so, what it would take, like the McGirt decision, for example, I'm just, I'm like, ooh, ooh, maybe some lightning will strike somebody and Congress won't pass a law that
Right.
like overturns the McGirt decision. But they did it with removal, so they'll do it again, I'm sure. Um,
Yeah.
but the thing is, like, you just have to, I think, take a minute sometimes to just appreciate the incredible solutions that Indigenous people offer to everybody. And Rebecca Nagel's This Land podcast made this so apparent with Oklahoma. Um, how Native people are providing for non-natives just when they
Mm.
have the opportunity and the say-so over their own jurisdiction to do so. And anyway, yeah, it just blows my mind that, like, we're prevented from providing ourselves basic services
Right.
because it doesn't line somebody's pocket. And you're like,
Hmm.
what? So anyway, it's pretty twisted.
It absolutely is. And I think it also ties into the next segment really well, and talking about the establishment of the Croatan Indian Normal School, which eventually came about in 1887, and talking about this exchange, providing resources from native to native and providing for community. But over time, as it's progressed and settler politics come into play, this kind of not even kind of has completely stripped a lot of that autonomy and a capability of a community giving to itself, or giving back to itself rather, in full capacity. So, did you touch on a little bit of the establishment of the school?
Yeah, so it goes. I mean, I have to talk about sort of race and racial hierarchies and racism again here.
Absolutely, it's a
um,
recurring element
it's,
always.
yeah, I mean, it's everywhere. So, that faction of folks who allied themselves with the Confederacy and the belief systems of conservative Democrats who were rejecting any hope really of not having a white supremacist state. Those folks who allied, those Lumbee folks who allied with that point of view, also began to use what they could when conservative Democrats regained power in North Carolina in the 1870s. Um, and so those alliances with politicians meant that politicians looked at Lumbee voters, because again, our right to vote was restored in the 1868 North Carolina Constitution. So we became a viable political force in that way again. And conservative Democrat politicians, once they gained control, began to look at us as a kind of a continually renewing source of support. They were already planning, I think then, to make North Carolina a one-party state where you couldn't vote for anybody except a Democrat. And so, of course, that promise became fulfilled in the 1898 Wilmington Massacre, which killed, horrendously dozens, if not hundreds, of African American people, and drove much of the rest of the black population out of Wilmington, displaced them in a illegal coup, where conservative Democrats were seizing control in the state for what they hoped would be forever. Well, they started plotting that in the 1870s with Lumbee voters. They could take advantage of the ways in which Lumbees did not want to be classified as black and did not want to be classified as white. They wanted to be classified as what we were, which was Native. And so white Democrats perceived that they could support our independent classification as Native people while also supporting this idea that they have, which was that everybody would become legally segregated, that white and black schools would serve white and black children separately, that black people could be basically permanently defunded. You want to worry about defunding somebody, let's worry about defunding the black community. So where black people could be permanently defunded by segregating them away from any of the opportunities and benefits of the law that white Americans would have. So they looked at the Lumbee population and our desire to articulate our identity as separate from black Americans and say, we can convince them that segregation is the right way to go, because that's what they want, or that's what they're saying they want. They're saying they want to be separate. And they're saying, for example, that they want their own schools. And so Lumbee leaders in alliances with conservative Democrats said, yeah, we do want our own schools. What do we have to do to get there? Right? And what they had to do to get there was for the state legislature to pass a law in 1885 that recognized us as a separate Indian community. And at that point, they called us Croatan in the law, because back to that lost colony story. I mean, just, that was that kind of story about our connection to the first European settlement in North America, which is not true, by the way. It wasn't the first European settlement anyway, but it was the first English settlement, maybe. I'm not even sure that's true, in North America. But our connection, or seeming connection, to that story justified the rightness kind of our segregation, because it meant that we were tied to Europeans, therefore sort of culturally, not superior maybe, but definitely culturally more aligned with European Americans than we were with African Americans. And so acknowledging our separateness and segregating our community, certainly in terms of education, meant that our existence justified the logic of racial segregation, which, was not what the economy depended upon. The economy didn't depend on segregation. The economy thrived when people were enslaved, right? Not segregated, when they were enslaved. And so white conservative Democrats were trying to get their wealth as close as they could to what they had when they were able to enslave people. And segregation was a new way of doing that emerged in the 1870s and 1880s. So Lumbee schools fit right along with that logic of segregation, and Lumbee leaders, certainly the ones that had allied themselves with conservative Democrats, were saying, this doesn't sound like too bad of an idea. I mean, if we can control the education of our children, that's what we've always done going back thousands of years, right? Why should we not do that now? And why shouldn't we do it using the advantage of this legal system that has basically spent all of its time punishing us up to this point? you know. So you can kind of see why people would agree to it. But they also didn't necessarily know, right, that Democrats were plotting this takeover,
Yeah,
this permanent
right.
political takeover of the state. Um, and at that point, Americans were citizens of their states. They were not largely, or there was just this national citizenship idea was just beginning. But state
Yeah.
politics really mattered. It still does. So, so this idea that Lumbees cared the most about what was happening in North Carolina is really logical for us as political actors. So anyway,
Mm.
these schools got established out of this kind of cauldron of what would white supremacy, the ideology of white supremacy, do with post-slavery America? And what would white supremacy do with formerly enslaved black Americans? And the Lumbees got very much caught up in the answer to that question of what would white supremacy do. Um, so our schools, though, as we know from our Who's Your People conversation, I mean, the school at Deep Branch is a super important school. The school in Pembroke is a super important school, just to our families, right, and to their identities,
Yeah.
and to the ways in which we're able to connect with one another. Like I told you before we started, like your great aunt went to school with my mom. I mean, that's, people in Deep Branch went to school with my dad. Those are connections that exist because of Indian only schools. And so what started as this like aggressively racist white supremacist construct of separate schooling, also became a kind of wellspring for identity. And sometimes people think I'm like trying to put a positive spin on it. Like I'm not trying to put a
Mm.
positive spin on it, but I'm just trying to say that there's two sides to this coin, you know, or rather it's a double-edged sword is what it is. I mean, it'll cut you, right? It's a
Right.
double-edged
Yeah.
sword. It's going to cut you twice. So it's going to cut in a good way in terms of how we can maintain community, and then it's going to cut in a super bad way in terms of how we are then required practically to distance ourselves from our black kin, you know, to
Hmm.
reject the ways in which multiracial coalitions could be to our advantage. Like many of our leaders just stop engaging in those activities after the 1880s. Now it's not
Mm.
gone forever, but it's like it really does slow way down after the 1880s. So anyway, the Croatan Indian Normal School, where you went to college, is now UNC Pembroke, where my parents went to college. My grandfather, my dad's father, was one of the first 4-year graduates of that school in
Oh
1929.
wow.
Yeah, it was. I mean, we just have such a huge. That place is like sacred to us.
It
My
really
yeah,
is.
I mean, my parents always talked about it as a sacred place, that university. And it's not like, I mean, it's got big problems. It's really
Yeah.
weird. I'm sure it's very weird to have a
Yeah.
black student at UNCP today, knowing what its chancellor did and attending the Trump rally that was in Robeson
Mm.
County. Like, you're not, that's going to be a violation to hear that that's a sacred place. And I hate
Yeah.
that that's how far apart we are as a society, to where a place that is so powerful to us as to be called sacred, you know,
Mm.
also exhibits is also such a deeply not just uncomfortable. I mean, it's just anyway, it can also be a place of tremendous violence if that sacredness isn't part of your history, you know? So I don't know how to square that with myself as a Lumbee
Right.
person. It's like it's hard. And then I think so. I try to be a historian for a second, and I try to say, well, it's also because of this enormous overweening system of white supremacy that then, Malinda, all you can do is try to engage in a concerted way to unlearn it. If I can unlearn it, maybe I can start to unteach it, or I can do other things to end it or prepare us for ending it you know but that's the only thing I know how to do with that deep conflict that is that university you know um
Right. Because over time, it started as something that, like you said, has that sacred element to it, to where it provided so much for folks because it was the only form of education you could get.
right
was access, especially with the further entrenchment of Jim Crow era policies that prevented natives who were unable to pass as white elsewhere the opportunity for education and some more of that upwards mobility, right? I'm pretty sure it's in your book. Uh, I read a lot of different Lumbee readings, so I might be getting it mixed up for my classes. But that furthered battle from figures like D.F. Lowery against the further entrenchment of that white settler colonial government getting its paws onto basically controlling the direction the school goes in, right? Who's teaching what, who the president of the institution is, and trying to help maintain that native control while facing the odds of, okay, if you don't go in line with what we're telling you to do, we're going to pull funds.
Right.
We're going to take resources away.
We're going to
So
take
there's
your
this
right to vote
pull, this tug
away.
and play.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's this interesting dynamic. It's so unfortunate, especially now, when you see things like the eventual inclusion of us into the UNC school system, which is great in a lot of different regards. But ultimately, for some folks, to them, it feels like it's also another pull away from that initial purpose of serving Indians. So there's always this weird dynamic that goes on. And of course, almost every school in the UNT system has its controversies that pop up every other month. We're not excluded.
Exhausted. Yeah.
So there is this weird dynamic that goes on with the the soul of the institution and where its body is now today.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great way to say it, that it is a battle for our soul. When you think about the leadership of the Lumbee community, and I would say many Native communities. I mean, I'm really grateful for this opportunity to dwell for such a long time on this topic.
Right.
And I think it's true of a lot of Native communities. You have leaders that find themselves in compromised positions. They didn't set out, to get there, right? They didn't set out to sell out.
Right.
They really didn't. Like they went into it saying, "I have skills here that I can use to preserve what's most important to my community, our soul. I have skills to help us preserve our soul against this." I'm sort of thinking so much about like the Cherokee Nation and what it went through with removal.
Mm,
You know, especially over its leadership, the ways in which leadership was so divided in that situation.
mm,
And in the aftermath, Major Ridge gets talked about as a sellout sometimes. Somebody who betrayed the Cherokee Nation. But you look at the sources, for one thing. You look at the primary sources. You look at his life. You look at the culture in which he was raised. And I cannot imagine him nor any of the Lumbee leaders that I've studied so extensively getting into this business in order to dispossess us, right?
right.
So what they find themselves in then is a deeply compromised situation that they have to ask themselves a question. Can I use my skills for good here? And what do I have to give up so I can keep doing that? Or rather, what do my people have to give up so I can keep using my skills? And we
Mm,
get into this a little bit of like, is it an us or is it a we? Is it an I? Is it a we or an I? Kind of like whose interests are being served here, right? We have to
right.
keep answering that question when we're talking about the soul of something.
Mm,
And the soul of our community, well, I think it's in our children. I think it's in our the ways that we talk, the ways that we sing, the ways that we eat. The things that we get out of the ground,
mm,
what we know how to do. I think that's our soul. But we have also been able to move through the world and maintain those things because of education, and especially because
right.
of education in a really standard Western European sense of the word.
Mm,
And so when we see like our educational institutions get compromised, like it feels like they are being or have been for a long time too, since the beginning.
yeah.
It was built in a compromised fashion, so of course it's still compromised. But it's just it's hard for people to really understand, like, what the right thing to do is. It's just not simple, you know?